I am Cassie O'Connor. I am from Glue Mobile, and I'm also part of the advisory board. And I have the privilege of introducing Tina Mary. Tina is a legit certified expert on cultural intelligence, also known as CQ. And CQ is so valuable for our industry. Like, we work in diverse settings with multiple cultures, so it's something that we all resonate with and we all can learn and gain expertise on. So she will, on her slides, she will show you how it benefits us and give action items to bring home to our studios. So I am super excited for this, and I hope you are too. And with that, Tina, the stage is yours.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm incredibly excited to be here. I did want to start by thanking the XDS Advisory Committee, and a big shout out to Cassie for her support in helping me prepare today. This is a message I've been wanting to deliver for a long time. A number of you have seen me present before on cultural awareness, and many of us will see it as a fundamental aspect of best practices for distributed development and external development. Cultural intelligence really is something different. It is a scalable and broadly relevant framework that we can use to help our teams be more engaged and efficient in our collaborations together. We've also seen a huge focus in the past few years, I'm focusing on unconscious bias and in creating more inclusive workplaces. CQ also has a role to play in helping us address those D&I initiatives. So, you've been asked to invest an hour today, and I know that's a lot. I typically deliver this content in a full one-day workshop with 15 to 25 people. And I really recognize there's a big gift of time you're giving me. We're going to try and allow for about 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. The three things I want to cover: I want to make sure you walk away clearly understanding what is CQ, how do I define it, how is it measured, how do I develop it, why should I care, what's the relevance to external development today. When we reflect on how we work effectively together, we really need to talk about cultural values, and we'll be discussing its relationship to CQ. And for me, again, that gift of time. You're giving me the gift of your time. I promise to give you the gift of at least one thing you can do actionably to improve your own cultural intelligence or that of your team. So that'll be your key win. Okay, now we're going to be talking a lot about culture, and I've had a few conversations about this already with people today, so I think it's important we stay aligned on what do we mean by the term culture. There was a Dutch psychologist by the name of Geert Hofstede. Geert said that culture is a shared pattern of beliefs, values, assumptions, and behaviors that distinguish one group of people from another. Now, we often think about that in the context of groups like national culture or religious culture. But what about culture when it comes to the family? How is the culture different at your in-laws versus it is at your own home? What about generational culture? How does what's accepted and familiar shift and change from my grandmother's generation to my mother's to mine to my children? And how does the generational shift affect us in the workplace? How did the behavioral rulebook change for us in the school ground versus in the classroom? What was the culture shift there? And then, of course, we've got the workplace. I have spent 15 years working at EA and then almost a year working at King Activision. I've lived in 4 different countries. I've seen organizational cultures, I've seen studio cultures, I've seen team cultures, I've seen silos within the team. So culture spans so many things that I like to think of it as culture is the way we do things around here, wherever here might be. So, with that aligned definition, let's move on to what is CQ. The formal definition of cultural intelligence means that we have the ability to communicate and work effectively with people from different cultures. The actual CQ construct itself came from some scientists who devised it in the early 2000s as an academic means of measuring and predicting intercultural performance. And the thing that I found absolutely fascinating when I learned about this is it was motivated by their observing the collaborations that happened during Y2K. Countries all over the world sent their brightest minds, their scientists and their engineers, to collaborate and figure out how to make sure the world's computers don't blow up when the millennial change occurs. And in fact, they were observed to be very ineffective in their collaborations. Those bright IQs did not know how to apply CQ and work effectively in that culturally diverse situation. They did not have innate high CQ. What does innate high CQ look like? Have you ever traveled with somebody, a family member or a friend, and seen how they just effortlessly seem to fit in and go with the flow no matter what the rules, customs, behaviors are? If you stay there for a while, you might see their clothing change. They pick up colloquial terms really quickly. They just seem to fit in. That's innate high CQ. But not everybody has it. So let's look a little bit deeper. If we think about CQ as being something that helps us work more effectively with people, I've had it observed that it sounds a little bit like emotional intelligence, doesn't it? But actually, emotional intelligence is very culturally conditioned. Think of it this way. Emotional intelligence is our ability to detect and regulate our own emotions and respond appropriately to the emotions of others. But the way we project sadness or happiness, for example, is extremely culturally conditioned. If I show direct eye contact in one culture, that might be considered respect and admiration and confidence. And in another, it could be seen as insubordination. Now, a way that cultural intelligence is similar to emotional intelligence is that CQ can be measured, and we're going to learn more about how we're going to do that. And most importantly for me, we can improve it. It's not fixed. IQ, yes, we're born with what we're born with, is what I'm told by science. EQ is something we can develop, and so is CQ. Now, it's important to note, I have observed this myself. If you have a team member who's low in emotional intelligence, start there. It's pretty hard to learn how to relate to other cultures if you don't know how to relate to your own. I said I would talk about the benefits, and these are proven, again, through a number of academic papers. Success in diverse markets. One of the stats I posted recently on LinkedIn that you might have noticed, that some studies show that of the international business failures that we see, up to 70% of them can be attributed to cultural differences. It's intuitive to believe that if we know how to work and collaborate and negotiate more effectively across cultures, we're going to be more successful in diverse markets relative to talent acquisition, relative to our partnerships, relative to all of our collaborations, even understanding our diverse audiences for the products we're trying to build. Those efficiencies are going to translate into speed and efficiency and higher quality results, better games. As your teams learn how to engage and collaborate in a more effective way, they're going to enjoy being together and working together. That engagement is going to increase, their productivity and results are going to grow. Yes, all of those things are going to make you more money, but then there's the added win that if you have high CQ leaders, they are going to be much better suited to find the opportunities that are relevant to the cultural context that they're in. What are those risks and opportunities that are relevant to my global market? And then I mentioned at the beginning about innovation and diversity, and again, this I found very interesting. There's a number of we've been told that innovation is very important in our business, right? We know that it's important. We want innovative games, we want innovative technical solutions, we want innovative production efficiencies. We also know the importance of diversity. It's not just the right thing to do. We believe it brings more innovation and innovative thought. But guess what? Studies show that if you take two teams, one who's homogeneous and one who's diverse, the homogeneous team might actually outperform the diverse team. And the reason for that is they get each other. They know how to collaborate effectively together. But once you add the component of cultural intelligence, your high CQ team that's diverse can outperform on innovation up to 3 times as much. That doesn't even reflect the productivity gains you're going to get. And again, a lot of papers written to prove these numbers. Don't worry about the graphs. It's more about understanding the exponential increase you can get. You need to get cultural intelligence to get true value from your diverse teams, at least your leaders. What do you get in it for yourself? What's in it for you? Well, whether you're traveling for pleasure, you're part of a multicultural team, you're being asked to lead up a new team, your ability to adapt and persevere is going to be increased. When things get crazy and sideways and go wrong, getting through those times is going to be easier as you have high cultural intelligence. Your personal effectiveness in all your relationships will increase, and people are genuinely going to want to work with you. They're going to like to be around you. It's time to actually look into what are we measuring? What is CQ? There are 4 capabilities we're going to cover, and we'll cover them a few times. The first capability gets at our motivation. How comfortable, how confident, how much do we want to seek out multicultural experiences, and how much do we enjoy them when they occur? Again, this is about perseverance, enjoyment, and motivation. The next capability is about cognition. How aware are we of the difference and similarities between cultures? And this can break down into things like business knowledge, socio-linguistic, and so on. Our third capability gets into metacognition. How aware are we of how to apply our awareness of those differences and similarities on a strategic level? How do we apply our knowledge in our interactions with other cultures? And the fourth capability gets down to our actual behavior. CQ action measures our ability to apply a repertoire of flexible verbal and nonverbal behaviors that are culturally appropriate. So far, so good? Cool. So the next slide is probably the most important slide of the presentation. We'll walk through it slowly. We're going to probably spend at least 3-4 minutes on it. And there's a lot to cover. But this gets into the heart of cultural intelligence, so I'm excited because we're really getting down to the meat of it. This is part of a sample report that is issued by the Cultural Intelligence Center, which is the organization through which I was certified. And the founder of that organization, by the way, is one of the original scientists behind creating the assessments and the CQ construct. So what we see in the first place, you might have noticed the color bands in the graph. And we have three. On the far left, we have light gray, which represents the low score ranges for people who have taken this assessment, so the bottom 25th percentile. In the middle of the chart, we have dark gray. This is where most people fall. This is our mid 50%. And to the far right, we have our top 25%. The next thing we should look at in this chart is that within each of the dimensions, we can see that the ranges, the low range, for example, looks different for each capability. We see the same thing if we go to the high side. What this tells us is because this is based on worldwide norms, everybody who's taken these before have fed into these graph results. It tells us that most people tend to think of their CQ as drive, their CQ drive as relatively high. In other words, they tend to think that they like seeking out multicultural experiences. Their confidence in their CQ knowledge is less, so we see a smaller band there for CQ knowledge. The next thing I want to bring to your attention is the numbers that are within each capability. And they're circled in blue here now. Now, these absolute numbers are not what's important. What we're trying to understand is where does that number fall within the range of the worldwide norms? Are we in the low, middle, or high? And within that range, where are we? So in this particular example, like most people, this person is right in the moderate range for all four capabilities. But if we look a little closer, we might observe something quite interesting. Something I didn't mention is that this report is just the summary report. If we looked at the full report, it breaks down into 4 further sub-capabilities. And as an example, strategy has the sub-capabilities of awareness, planning, and checking. This example shows us this person has an absolute score of 61 in strategy, which is almost into the bottom 25th percentile. And yet their CQ knowledge, only moderately higher absolute score of 69, is almost pushing into the top 25th percentile. So we can see that the absolute numbers aren't what's important, it's that relative range. And this also tells us that this person might be underutilizing their CQ knowledge in terms of their ability to apply strategy. Without knowing what the detailed report looks like, it's hard for me to suggest how we might guide this person. For example, if CQ checking was where they were a little bit lower in their CQ strategy scoring, it might be that they needed to check more of their assumptions and mental maps. So they have the right thinking process going on, but they're not doing enough checking the assumptions that they're making. Or perhaps it's on the awareness piece, and we want to share more business cases with them and give them more examples of how to apply their knowledge in a meaningful way. So this really gets to the heart. This report really gets to the heart of how we can develop CQ. You can run these assessments for individuals. You can run them on a team level and run group reports that collate the results. You can include a 360 component with observers, so you see a second set of absolute numbers on the chart, and you can see if there's a gap in your understanding versus those of your observers. You can do pre and post assessments, so you can run an assessment and then look and see how they did 6 months or a year later to see how a development program is running. We've now looked at what the CQ capabilities are. We've looked at how we measure and understand how we might use that information to develop them. It's time to talk about cultural values, because if we're going to talk about how to work effectively together, cultural values represents our preferred way of working together. It's very deeply rooted in us. It's something that comes from a lifetime of experiences. How does the way we prefer to work together show up in the workplace and in our collaborations? How can we look at that? The way that we can look at it is there's a variety of assessments and tools on the market that let us do it. Surveys, things that are called cultural value profiles. We're going to look at least one example, and I'll share a couple of other examples you can go look into. And what they're meant to do is help us reflect on our own behaviors and the behaviors of others, and help us understand when they might be reflective of cultural differences and what to do about that. So the things that cultural value profiles can tell us is generally about our orientation to life, to work, to relationships. They can also help uncover some of our biases, whether they're conscious or otherwise. They are not meant to predict our cultural intelligence, nothing to do with that. Most CV profiles that I've seen are rooted in the work done by Hofstede. A number of you will have heard of terms like individualism and collectivism and power distance index and so on. This is a list of the 10 cultural values that I typically profile in my workshops. And in the interest of time, we'll take a look at one of them. Context. Context is about your preferred method of communication. This is, if you are a direct communicator, you prefer explicit, clear communications, you want words, you say what you mean what you say. An individual who prefers a high context or indirect means of communication is going to focus more on harmonious communications and saving face, and much more attention should be paid to how things are said and the body language and tone, for example. So if I'm high context, working with a low context person, I need to really focus on being explicit and direct and getting my message across as clearly as I possibly can. And conversely, if I'm direct and I'm working indirect, recognizing the importance of silence, checking for body language, checking for what's not being said becomes extremely important. Now, that having been said, I think you're all going to find this very interesting. Almost all of you are working with multicultural teams. Erin Meyer, who's an international business professor and author, tells us in an excellent book called The Culture Map that multicultural teams need low context processes. And this makes sense. She explains to us that with multicultural teams, we have so many opportunities for miscues and translation errors and opportunities to handle information sharing incorrectly. That we're going to have a lot of roadblocks. So if we coach our teams to work through very explicit, low context processes and communication protocols, we can avoid a lot of the pitfalls that we'll normally encounter in that regard. This is not saying that your low context team members need to suddenly communicate in a different way. We're talking about processes that you can adapt that reduce the risk of the issues that you would encounter if you don't explicitly work through this. This is an example of a cultural value profile where we're just seeing one of the orientations. This is from the Cultural Intelligence Center as well. Like most CV profiles, we see where our orientation lies visually. So the first thing we can notice is an arrow, and that tells me where my personal preference might exist between low and high context range. Another thing you'll observe is that there's what's called global clusters listed in the chart. There are 10 of them. They are based on a study called the Global Leadership Study, or the GLOBE study, and they're representing countries that have those basic value preferences. So they're countries or groups of countries where that's the predominant preference. Now, there's no right place to be on this chart, right? Being in the middle doesn't suddenly make you more moderate individual. If you're in the middle, you're probably going to have very many challenges communicating to anybody on the far left or the far right of this chart. So it's really, the usefulness of this is a number of things. So it's first of all a good way to reflect. It's a good way to look for potential gaps. If I have not worked with somebody who's coming from Asia and I am low context, I might guess that they might be high context. Now I absolutely have to challenge and guard my assumptions. This is just a useful way to create a sort of a sophisticated stereotype to base my thinking. But if I'm using my CQ strategy, I'm going to check my assumptions. Which brings me to that. What do we assume? What assumptions do we bring in our day-to-day life and in our interactions? And how do they show up for us in the workplace? How do they show up with us in our collaborations, in our negotiations, and so on? As an example, if I'm low context and I'm looking for information from you and you're high context and you don't give it to me, what should I assume? Do I assume you're hiding something or that you simply have nothing important to share? If I give you very critical feedback or I'm delivering an important message to you and you say nothing, what should I infer? And is that a fair inference? I want to try a test right now. People like tests, right? It's a really quick one, I promise. So imagine you're in a boat and the boat is sinking. And in the boat with you, you have your spouse, your mother, and your child. Now, I want you to fix this answer in your mind. Who are you going to save if you can only save one person? Will you save your mother, your spouse, or your child? Now, if you were like me, at the moment this question was asked, you had an answer in your brain. The facilitator in my workshop asked us to go to a corner of the room for our response, and I practically ran there. Now, I consider myself fairly culturally intelligent, but I really expected most of the room to follow me. What do you think happened? Well, from one study, this was the actual results, and it actually reflected the room. There was a lot of people not standing with me in that corner of the room. And the facilitator asked somebody to explain where they were standing, and he gave us a wonderful answer. He said, look, if my mother was here, she would tell you, you can get married again. You can have more babies. You will only have one mother. Oh. So I honestly, it really shook my assumptions. It challenged me to reflect a little bit on the biases I bring and how much culture comes into play when I don't realize it. I mean, to me, it was very fundamental to think, of course I should save my child. Shouldn't everybody? But it wouldn't occur to me that maybe in that moment, even with high CQ that I thought I had, that this person from a different cultural background might think very differently about that question. So, we've talked about how to measure CQ. What is CQ? How to measure it? We've then reflected on the impact of cultural values in it. How can we actually improve it? How do you get the win I promised for you? Now let's do it. So, to do that, I want to go through a quick recap of the capabilities to start with. And as we go through this recap, think for yourself about which capability do you believe you probably want to work on the most or help your team work on the most, maybe one or two. So CQ drive. Are you motivated and interested to seek out cultural experiences? When things go sideways, do you tend to persevere? Do you like trying new things and meeting new people? Your CQ knowledge, how aware of you or how different or similar cultures are, whether it's how leadership styles are preferred or what behaviors you should observe in a meeting protocol, how information is preferred to be shared. Your CQ strategy, how are we reflecting on and planning for those multicultural interactions before they happen? How are we checking the assumptions we make when we go into them? And how are we actually behaving, CQ action? How are we able to change our behaviors in a way that's appropriate, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, to adapt to different demands? So the next slide is before we move on to my tips, I forgot about this slide. This is actually very cool. I love this slide. So you've now had a chance to reflect on which capability you thought you might want to work on the most. This slide also comes from the Cultural Intelligence Center, and it helps us understand that not all CQ capabilities might be created equal. So if, for example, if I'm a VP and I'm being asked to set up a new line of business or a head of the sales organization, I'm expanding into new markets, for sure I want to develop all 4 capabilities equally. If I'm the business development manager or legal counsel, my ability to have good, strong negotiation skills is very important. So even though I might have slightly lower CQ strategy than CQ action, I might focus on my CQ action capability first as a priority. If I'm going on an expat assignment, or I'm being asked to undertake an assignment as part of a multicultural team, culture adaptation might be my key to think about. So just reflect on your role within the organization as you decide, where you might want to focus your energy. Okay, so this is an example of a group profile where we can improve cultural intelligence at a group level. So if we look at the range in a group, and by the way, mind the gap is a very colloquial term. Is there anybody here who doesn't know that term? Who's never heard the term mind the gap? Anybody? Okay, cool. So mind the gap is actually a British colloquial term that you hear when you get on and off the underground. And you hear a lady say, mind the gap, because she's worried about you stepping on the hole between the train and the station. And it was a reminder to me and you that we use colloquial terms a lot in our day-to-day work and our presentations, and we have to be careful. I was pretty sure there'd be somebody in the room who might not know that term. So I'm talking about the gap between the range of a team. What we're seeing here is a team's sample results. And we can see the lowest person on that scored in low context was around 26, and in high, 75. And in power distance, which for those of you who are not familiar with that value dimension, that represents how we see authority or how we think about our bosses. So imagine this team who has such an opposing view on how they see authority and how that's showing up. Now, interestingly enough, a real-life story, I had 2 senior directors who that was true for. We had one very high power, one very low power, and as they talked through it in our workshop, they realized that had shown up in a way that they've been able to manage up easier to an executive in a more balanced way, because they kind of did a yin-yang on each other as they realized how they needed to deal with this executive issue. So that's an example of where it was harder for them to come together, but their diversity of thinking actually created a huge win for them in managing up a tricky situation. This is another example of how you can look at cultural values and culture value gaps, is doing mapping exercises. So in the workshop, what I might do is I put these flip charts out around the room, and I'll list the 10 value dimensions on the chart. And I'll have groups of 4 or 5 people go up to each flip chart and have them mark down the results from their self-assessments. And then I'll ask them to have conversations in their small groups to think about, how is this showing up for us? Where are we clustered? Where are we far apart? And what does this mean? Even more powerful is for you ahead of this exercise to think about, what are the current challenges we're facing today when we think about collaboration in external development? Is it our decision making? Is it how we share information? Is it how we give and receive feedback? And then ask the team to apply that filter to how they talk about how those values show up within context with those business issues. And it can help you understand how to create processes and protocols that'll help smooth over and seam some of the seams. So, some of the personal strategies that I have used to develop cultural intelligence. At the end of this slide, I'd love for each of you to have a personal intention statement. Send yourself an email, write a note, tell the guy beside you, this is what I'm going to do in the next 1 to 2 weeks to improve my cultural intelligence for myself or my team. So, CQ Drive. CQ Drive, the things that I have done before is simply make a list. I'm a list person. I'm a project manager at heart. Making lists calm me down, make me feel better. If CQ Drive is about my motivation to seek out multicultural experiences, then sitting down and writing all the intrinsic and extrinsic benefits that I get from them can help increase my motivation. Seeking out low-hanging fruit of pleasurable cultural experiences can help as well. Maybe I'll go to a new ethnic restaurant. Maybe I'll have lunch with somebody on the team that I never had lunch with before and learn about their culture. If I want to focus on CQ knowledge, there's so much information out there, to be honest, and I'm going to be sharing a slide in a moment with some resources for you. But one example of something I've done is I've tried to assess, how does my leadership style show up in terms of cultural value preferences? Is my approach to leadership suitable to everybody in my team? And if not, how can I be more adaptable? I can also do a team exercise here. You can have your team sit down and have a brainstorming and talk about what are the idioms and jargon we use. And again, are we making sure that we're sharing that with each other across our global locations? Because they do tend to be very local in nature, don't they? If I want to build my CQ strategy, One example I talked about earlier was that filter in the culture value mapping exercise. So this was, again, a real example where we had a central team that was making many layers of decisions that they needed to make within that group, supporting global teams. And so what they sat down and thought about is, what are all the decisions we are making, who needs to be involved in them, and how will they be made? And that allowed them to really be much more culturally intelligent in reflecting what the needs of the different teams and leaders were in those decision-making processes. CQ action is about behaviors. So to me, I think this tends to be about getting out of my comfort zone. I'm going to try and do something that I'm not comfortable doing, probably. So an example might be having a conversation with somebody and intentionally not looking at them in the eye, or standing closer or further apart than I normally would. I'm a fairly expressive person, and so being quieter and more contained in my body language and in my demeanor is an important cultural intelligence behavior for me to adapt at the right moments. Something that's hard for me, but I do try to do it. So look at this slide and think about it. What are you going to do? What could you do? I'm sure you guys have other ideas, so perhaps we can share them in the Q&A with each other and get other ideas out there. This is just a very small amount. And I think that the most important message I could say is that you can improve your CQ very easily with small steps. Some resources for you. I mentioned Erin Meyer. She wrote a fantastic book I highly recommend called The Culture Map. This is a book that gets really into the practical elements of thinking about how we do things like make decisions and deal with conflict in the workplace as it relates to global cultures. She does have a free assessment out there if you look at that link that I put called What's Your Culture Profile. She uses a different assessment means and, again, a different value dimensions, but it's highly relevant and highly useful, so go have a look at it. The Cultural Intelligence Center is where I was certified. They have e-learning, and even I think they've got a massive online open course coming up soon. They offer both training and certifications in cultural intelligence, culture values, and unconscious bias. And if you're interested, I gave you a list of the 10 values that I cover in my workshops, and if you look at that CV detail link, it will take you to a quick explanation of each one of them, like about a 2-sentence explanation. I don't believe any set of resources when we're talking about culture is complete without the grandfather of culture, in my opinion, when it comes to business culture, and that's Hofstede. I love referring back to his resources, and this particular link lets you get a quick snapshot of understanding country, culture, etiquette, business do's and don'ts, and things like that. So a really good, useful resource for building your CQ knowledge. And the Culture Wizard is another CQ knowledge tool. The Culture Wizard is one that's been around for a long time, and there's a variety of other similar ones out there. They tend to focus a bit more, in my opinion, or in my experience at least, on cultural awareness. So that's not a bad thing. But I think we have to be careful that we look holistically at how we talk about culture and not just focus on raising awareness, but what are we going to do about it? Right? And I firmly believe CQ lets us do that and take this conversation beyond just a conversation into something where we see meaningful change, meaningful impact, and a more inclusive and happy workplace where we want to engage in cross-cultural collaborations. I want to really make sure, I don't even know, I think we might be running ahead of time, I'm not really sure, so I'll just keep going. I want to make sure we achieve what we set out to do. So we said we were going to look at what is cultural intelligence. I would love to know that all of you can walk out naming the 4 dimensions: drive, knowledge, strategy, action, and really know what they're all about, that you understand a little bit about how it's measured and the fact that we can develop it. I hope you got a better sense of your own, of the impact of cultural values, and maybe had a couple of surprises there for yourself that were helpful. And most importantly, I hope you're walking away with that win, that you actually do have something tangible that you feel comfortable that you can action that will help you or your team improve cultural intelligence. At this point, I would love to take questions. I would also be very happy to continue this conversation later today or at any point in the future. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.